Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I like you mentioned, Brad. I do work in a tech company, so some of the things that I deal with are closer to customers than it is through an academic filter. So when this prompt was given to us to speak, AI and rights, a million different things went through my head. So the talk that I'm going to give is going to be like a scatter shot of my observations from working in tech and having a foot in academia, and also where I see this field going. So like I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but I am a researcher in ethics, and I'm seeing a few different things from my past work and what continues to happen. So what I have seen from my past work in measuring bias in algorithm-mediated hiring is that AI has made that problem worse. So we already had these types of biases back in 2020 when the George Floyd incident happened. This all came out in the open that companies were using regression-based systems, but they were biased to begin with. That has not gone away despite regulations. So New York City Local Law 144 exists, and my paper back in 2020 was one of the papers cited in that legislation. It requires these models to be audited, but then that has completely come back with AI. ChatGPT and Gemini continue to do this, but in a more covert way instead of an overt way. Um, we are also seeing, in terms of the economy, that AI has massively taken over and not in a very clear way. So the image on the left just came out in the Financial Times, and people are already drawing parallels with what was going on in 2008, which is companies were over-leveraged and inexorably tied with each other, meaning if OpenAI ceases to exist tomorrow, it will cause a ton of cascading effects. So let's just talk about NVIDIA. Like, that is so tied to the American and global economy at this point that it's too big to fail. Where are we headed to when we are so dependent on the AI economy as a society? We have heard from the first panel that AI now has started to form romantic relationships. 1 in 5 high schoolers has had a romantic relationship or know somebody who has. I interacted with the journalist who wrote the "I Hate My Friend" piece, Boone, wonderful piece, because like I wrote a hate post on LinkedIn about it, and he picked it up, which was great. It's insane that people are now being sold a product that makes them stay at home and not talk to real people as something that we should be aspiring towards. Like, that's just insane to me. Um, Obviously, we have seen that that can have extremely detrimental effects. A teenage boy using ChatGPT recently killed himself, and that led to, once again, renewed conversations about what kind of parental controls and agency we should have in these systems. OpenAI publicly added parental safety controls, but now I feel like we are going in the complete opposite direction with this type of like giving up of our privacy. Europe has the same problem with what they call chat control. The chat control legislation is doing something similar, in the sense now we are going from this unregulated ecosystem to an extremely regulated ecosystem, which is eroding our privacy. So like, there's no winning. And in all of these different ways, my viewpoint is that AI is transforming rights. AI is now increasingly being used to measure the allocation of resources and access. It models this to already decide who sees what, who gets matched to job, who can access goods. Then we had a brief period of fairness, ethics research, and regulation around it in the insurance industry, in hiring. But all of that has once again become murky with generalized chatbots, which are so general purpose that it's hard to regulate them. Um, I just mentioned that social and economic relations are between companies or between people are changing. And finally, one thing that I don't think we have talked about and we should during our discussion is there is now a overload of information via the licensing regime that people are not reading carefully. Most recently, this happened with OpenAI Sora, so the video generation model. When they released it, they did not have any clause in the fine print about liability on OpenAI when somebody produces something that is copyrighted, or when somebody uploads copyrighted videos to modify it to create a deepfake. just behind the scenes, they quickly just changed the terms of service to say the user is liable for whatever happens. We are not liable at all. So that's insane that, in the absence of regulations, companies are taking regulation into their own hand via like shady licensing. So I will talk about the three different rights that we've heard about today, but again, not from a lawyer's perspective, but from a very technical, what I'm seeing perspective. What am I seeing in terms of intellectual property rights? So data and training inputs have become de facto capital, to the point that companies are willing to pay upwards of $500 million with a single company for their data, because publicly open data has been fully scraped from the internet, and now it's a rush for who can get whatever remaining high quality data that exists. We talked about, already have touched on generated outputs challenging existing copyright and ownership norms. The US Copyright Office has been coming out with, well, we don't have a new copyright law. The copyright law that exists is 95 years old, so obviously it is being stretched to corners that nobody thought about 100 years ago. So the Copyright Office, in the absence of Congress enacting new laws, is coming up with explanations as to how fair use and other angles of the copyright law can be applied to existing AI models. And I think they're doing a decent job, despite that whole office being completely politicized and heavily lobbied right now. That brings me to what we have to do as a company. We as a company have been looking into utilizing exceptions that are provided. So like Hugging Face is an open source company. So we rely heavily on text and data mining exceptions in the EU. What our arguments are like, open source models are useful for research, so we should be given an exception, and so on. That's like the mechanization part of it. That doesn't really apply to like, creating deepfakes. That's not research. So like these nuances are not known to the public, and it's definitely pushing property rights in different directions. We saw this in 2020, I believe this was 2022 or 3, early that summer, when both the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild went on strike in Hollywood when AI was just first coming out. Writers went on strike because they wanted a deal that would pay them fairly for AI usage of their previous work. Actors did not want to sell their their images for free to orgs without a new license, without a new deal. Because of all of these protests and lawsuits, we are finally in 2025 starting to see the outcomes of those lawsuits. So Anthropic recently was in this really ugly case where, in order to get around requirements of paying publishers for using books, they instead tried to exploit a loophole, saying that if I have physically purchased the book, I'm allowed, and now I own it, so I'm allowed to do whatever with it. So they bought millions of books, they scanned them, and then they destroyed them. And they said that we don't have to pay licensing fees to anybody. They obviously got caught and now have to pay $1.5 billion to the authors. So these tricks are being caught, and yet there is so much vagueness that people are still finding creative ways around it. Which brings us to what can companies ethically do. So companies are now trying to sign licenses with publishers. OpenAI has, spent upwards of billions of dollars at this point with different companies. Reddit recently struck tens of millions of dollars deals with individual companies. So they have a deal with OpenAI, they have a deal with Google, they have a deal with Anthropic. But what we are not talking about enough is that this conversely puts small developers and small startup owners in an extremely disadvantaged position. Assuming that data from, Le Monde or The Atlantic is useful data that would improve AI, why should only a company that is extremely SoftBank funded and has access to billions of dollars be able to use it if their goal is to benefit humanity? So I don't know, legal questions and also ethical questions there. I just mentioned a few minutes ago that we as society have run out of data that can be freely scraped from the internet. We fully have run out of it. The Common Crawl project just has said that we can only collect new data because we have scraped everything. However, there is a ton of data in the real world that's waiting to be unlocked, that's not digitized, which is in places like libraries and museums. So I wrote this article with my colleague called Empowering Public Organizations Preparing Your Data for the AI Era, wherein we make the point that we don't have to sign expensive licensing deals to get good information from the internet or from the world. Boston Public Library is sitting on, what, 150 years worth of US government documents that are not digitized and not on the internet, but yet it is public property. It came from taxpayer money. So there are initiatives like the Institutional Data Initiative out of Harvard University who are working with us to us and BPL obviously. So they have already finished digitizing the Harvard Library, the Harvard Museum. They're working now with BPL to digitize all of those books and then put them in the public domain for to give small companies and startups a fair chance. There's a lot of useful information that comes out of public data, like the image there, European art YOLO. It's my colleague made it. He used publicly scanned images of European art that is past copyright and he created an image object detection system. So my point here is that you don't have to take artists' hard-earned data or authors' hard-earned work. You can find creative public data that's out there if you just have the will to look for them and then use them properly. If anything, I would say those publicly available public source data is more authoritative and more correct than getting data from Reddit, which is often full of misinformation. So again, this is why development should be done more carefully instead of chasing profit, which just means that you just scrape everything and then dump it into a model. That's not how you get good quality data or good quality models. I want to talk a little bit about human rights. I will not talk about robot rights because that's a whole new kind of worms, but I thought that it was fun to include in the image. The way human rights are being eroded are by privacy and surveillance. We talked quite a bit about privacy and surveillance today. We are also seeing non-discrimination, or rather, human rights, like non-discrimination, are being eroded because models have biases, models have exclusion. I will talk about that in just a second. When you have a black box making a decision, you don't have due process because you don't have explainability. We just talked about explainability earlier. And I would love to talk about, I'll touch on cognitive autonomy, meaning right now what we're seeing is this insidious phenomenon called over-reliance. I constantly see tweets from fellow developers saying, oh, I used to be able to write for loops in Python, and now I find my brain reaching for the AI to write something that is just a simple for loop. I don't know why, it has just become a habit, which then causes two problems. It causes cognitive over-reliance, and also it causes, we talked about human in the loop as a solution. Even in the previous talk, we heard that as a potential solution. But then what happens if the majority of internet activity is coming from bots? How can you really have a human in the loop for everything? Scalable oversight is a big problem. So AI has famously enabled and been misused for public surveillance. Again, the George Floyd riots sparked a lot of conversation in this, and that led to a lot of cities banning facial recognition systems because we know from a lot of studies, including Joy Bolamwini's study, that is a beautiful movie now on Netflix called Coded Bias, that people with darker skin tones are actually more likely to be misidentified by facial recognition systems, and therefore a lot of innocent people were being caught in police dragnets. So there's a lot of public knowledge around that, but once again, everything that's old is new again. Multimodal systems that can now absorb images along with text are continuing to doing the same thing. Censorship is a big problem. Censorship by government control in general has been a thing, but now now that information retrieval doesn't just happen from the internet, it happens via text models. We are seeing this happen in terms of LLMs. So there was this study that just came out of the US Center for AI Security, or CASE, which looked at DeepSeek models and compared them to ChatGPT and Anthropic models. One of the prompts that they tested was, is there forced labor in Xinjiang? DeepSeek R1, you can see that it's claiming very strongly that this is misinformation, there is no intentional harm being done to people. We are always for people or worker rights. Meanwhile, ChatGPT very happily is saying the US version of that event, which is UN, human rights, and everybody said that that is happening. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is a well-known case where people have strong opinions on, but if you use a system in a black box, which you don't know who made that system, there might be much more insidious values that are different from your own values or your own societal values that might seep into your work stream. So a very easy example of this is this study that was done at the University of Amsterdam, where they tested Chinese and American models in the back end of therapy chatbots. So Asian and Chinese societal systems are more collectivist, meaning that they encourage living in multi-generational households. Parents are like gods and whatnot. So one thing they tested out was asking, I'm having issues with my parents, what should I do? I'm 18 years old, I have a job. So the Chinese model said that, oh, you should still listen to your parents, they have raised you, abuse does not exist, you're making this all up. And American models were like, you can move out, you have a job. Meaning that it's just like a lot of downstream problems that can happen if you don't allow for value plurality in models, which is what is happening because the system design doesn't allow for user to change the values of the system they're interacting with. I want to talk a little bit about AI voice bias. This is understudied, but this is something I experience on a day-to-day basis. I live in, my husband is American, so we have Alexa in our house, which is set to an American accent. I ask it to play Bollywood songs all the time, and Alexa doesn't understand when I say it correctly. But then when my husband says it in an American accent, which is not the right way to say the name of the song, Alexa understands it. And it's crazy to me that, that there's no right or wrong. It's just like what technology that you're trying to use has decided is how you interact with the world, which then causes bias and digital exclusion and feelings of erasure. I experienced this when in my art piece, Because of You, which got the Best AI Art Award at CVPR last year. In short, this is like a narrative about Henrietta Lacks and how her cells were taken without her permission, linked with artists' work being taken without permission. But in doing the piece, I used 11 Labs, which is a voice cloning system, to narrate the whole piece. I did not try to do anything. I just gave it a 30-second sample of my voice and the script for this piece. And what 11 Labs came up with was the script, except it sounded like me, but had an American accent. So my accent was completely erased, and I felt like I was erased from my own piece, which I thought was an interesting commentary on Henrietta Lacks' experience also. And it was very well received, but it was fascinating to me. I have done a lot of work in investigating bias in very specific contexts and very specific models. So this quick study was on colorism and gender imbalance study for AI, but in the Indian context. So I looked at stable diffusion and saw how certain understudied things like caste are manifested in models. Again, when I ran these prompts, I saw that these models are still biased even in the Indian context, where race is not necessarily a thing, but other markers like education or class or wealth or caste continue to be problems. And I saw that that still is happening. Women just straight up like didn't appear in educated generations, but in uneducated, they started appearing. Also, uneducated was correlated with darker skin tone. Same for caste. Lower caste people were denoted with darker skin tone. And for occupation, again, women were overrepresented in lower paying jobs like textile worker and also darker skin tone, just like an ongoing theme. Meaning that representation issues, and I mean, there are a lot of scholars here who have done much better work on this, is media misrepresentation then causes your feelings of microaggression and erasure and just bad experiences with how we see the world. So we took all of these findings, and this paper is coming out next week. I mean, it is out on arXiv, but the conference is next week at AIES, where we are documenting patterns of exoticism. We saw that this is a repeating theme across cultures. For example, in that image, in the second image, we tried generating images of Egyptians cooking versus a British person cooking, and the Egyptians were shown with their traditional Egyptian garb, which nobody wears now. It's like literally from mummies. So that was weird, but like we documented that, and I think it's a very interesting paper. The final human right that I think is starting to be corroded is human agency itself via loss, over-reliance, and therefore loss of cognition. So this is a paper that I came out earlier this year at a Kai workshop called Tools for Thought, in which we posit that traditional learning, according to Bloom's revised taxonomy, happens in these 6 distinct pillars. With the first thing starts, the first step in that learning is remembering, and the final step is creating. What we claim in that paper is that when the internet first came about, because people love to say, if Google exists, then why shouldn't ChatGPT exist? Well, the big problem is that when the internet came about, yes, you didn't have to remember things, you didn't have to make a trip to the library to look into a book, but you still had to go through the rest of the steps. When you saw an article on Google, you start to read it, understand it, apply it, and then create your report. With ChatGPT or with an LLM, all of those processes are being shortcut, and you're directly going to the step of creation, meaning that you're not doing any of the essential work in doing this work, in learning anything at all. What we claim is that we need something called metacognitive prompting. Again, as a person who works in AI, I would never claim that AI is a not beneficial technology. It is, but it depends very much on how you use it. And how it should be used is to re-trigger your brain to go through all of the steps of Bloom's taxonomy. So we wrote a follow-up paper, or my co-authors wrote a follow-up paper on doing a real study with real humans, where they modified the system to give something called metacognitive prompts, which supports reflective or critical thinking, and that actually massively improved, once again, learning outcomes. So there are ways to make AI work for you instead of just using a chatbot that you have no agency in, and you're forced one single perspective, whether Chinese or American or what else, and then over time because of your cognitive laziness and because of this singular viewpoint that is being bombarded towards you, you lose a ton of agency, which can come back if we support value pluralism by system design and we support metacognitive prompt thinking. The last thing I would like to talk about is labor rights. Very controversial topic right now. Certain tasks are automated. Agents change who supervises work and how tasks are allocated. So AI agent or agentic AI is the new paradigm. With that, we have started talking a lot about de-skilling versus upskilling. So whether people's skills are being replaced, whether people themselves are being replaced, or whether they're being upskilled with AI. And finally, concentration of power. So when people are being replaced from jobs, that doesn't necessarily mean that society is being benefited. It just means that that new wealth that is created by firing somebody is just going to the person who made the AI system or is in control of the AI system. So we have started seeing a transfer of wealth to like NVIDIA and OpenAI and whatnot in macroeconomic scales, which is terrible. And it's a policy problem that I don't know if the government is ready to solve. So I just talked about scalable oversight crisis. So it is true that bots now make up the majority, more than 50% of all internet traffic. In that case, as practitioners, we can't just say, oh, we should have a human in the loop. That doesn't work in a scalable way because you can't have a human in every loop. We need to think about architecture, AI, online architecture in the agentic era. We need to start thinking about things like expiring tokens, chain of custody, agent ID, separate channels for agent traffic versus regular human use. Current internet is made for humans. You have like things like icons to click on and whatnot. Agents don't need all that. Some people are now talking about creating a parallel internet where agents will access only text that they need via MCP protocols and whatnot. The horrifying thing that has happened in the past, I want to say 3 years. So when OpenAI first came out with ChatGPT, their vision for AGI was that something that will change the whole world. It will be this omnipotent, powerful thing. But obviously that is not working because LLMs are not going to save us. That's not how we reach intelligence. They also know this. So very slyly earlier this year, they changed the definition of AGI to mean highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at the most economically valuable work, which is crazy because the most the most economically valuable work is not necessarily the kind of work that is beneficial for humans, right? People doing software engineering get paid more than somebody making food. That does not mean that one job is more important than the other, but it means that OpenAI has targeted one job before the other. Um, this wonderful tweet that I keep thinking about every 2 days is also what I agree with, which is I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes. Why aren't we as a society deciding to make clothes folding robots and things that make food for us so that we can get out of human drudgery and actually focus on things that matter? I don't know. I mean, at least as Hugging Face, we have open source robots, we have open source arms that you can 3D print at home. You don't even have to buy from us. And we are open sourcing programs that fold clothes. So we are doing what we can as a startup, but we shouldn't have to do everything. Like there should be policy solutions to this that dictate where research funding should go. To that point, chatbots won't save humanity. So this paper that just came out, I communicated about this on Monday. I wrote this paper with my wonderful colleague, Georgia Channing. AGI type, LLM type systems are really terrible at generalized science understanding. So the first image shows a fine-tuned model to predict planetary axes. And it does do so. It predicts a planetary path really well. But when you then ask the same fine-tuned model to show where the direction of the Newtonian forces are, it has not learned that. So clearly, text-based LLMs, you cannot really fine-tune it to do advanced scientific understanding. And despite that, OpenAI was recently claiming that a particular biotech company uses more in terms of OpenAI tokens than the entire US government combined, meaning that they have a vested interest to sell their product, which doesn't work, to biotech companies, and therefore actually harming scientific research. The second image shows that current LLMs, which expect words as tokens to go in, are in no way suited for multi-omics, like genomics, proteomics data. That just straight up doesn't look like words. Therefore, they're not tokenizable, and therefore, the final output that comes out is garbage. And yet, companies are using that for research. So we launched this initiative called Hugging Science, where we're inviting interdisciplinary researchers, so scientists who think about changing the world and would like to use AI, and then machine learning developers who want to do the right thing, but they don't know how to do it. We have brought them together, and they're actually doing fantastic work. We have already seen like 5,000 plus signups on the Discord, and we have started seeing organizations start creating scientific models on the hub. My favorite graphic to show in this matter is this thing that came out yesterday from the Allen Institute. They discovered something called Cell Transformer, which instead of using words, it uses cellular data as input. So they have completely changed the architecture to still use the benefits of transformers, but in a way that actually now works for biology. So I would like to see more of this policy solutions and funding to go towards more of this research. The final thing that I want to talk about is labor agency. We often, while talking about labor rights, talk about AI is something that is happening to us, and that's not true. In doing the research that I did with my own voice being distorted, so I did a follow-up paper where I interviewed other people in their experience. I found this company called Tomato.ai that sells an accent neutralization service to call centers. Now think about it for 1 second. Changing somebody's accent is a conscious choice that the business developer, that the call center owner has made. It's not a choice that the worker had in being subject to this AI, and it's not agentic enough. Like you're not only are you perpetuating this type of bias by forcing this technology on people, you're not giving workers an option out. So I think we also need to start thinking about agency of humans and allowing humans the right to refusal. Like if somebody can do the same kind of output without AI, they should be allowed to do so. So what can we do? Well, what's the path forward? There are a few different things that I've been working on. So I've been working a lot on standardized disclosure and flaw reporting, so like standardized model cards and so on. Talking about proportional liability. So if something goes wrong, who should be liable? Not just the user, not just the developer, not just the person who forced that AI on somebody, but we need to figure out who was proportionally responsible for what. talking about data governance, license and opt-outs, so the fine prints which companies get away with should also be standardized and be made more open to the public. We should design for cognitive safety, so we should think more about metacognitive prompts and how we can use AI better in teaching so that students also have agency. And finally, we should move towards a more interdisciplinary research agenda, because I don't know what you know, you don't know what I know, and we don't have a way where we can talk about this. So more of these types of gatherings and online forums where scientists can talk to machine learning developers, ethicists can talk to machine learning developers, and so on. And with that rambling talk, we have come to the end, so thank you.